everybody for joining us, and thanks Julie for setting this up. I'm really excited about the webinar today. So my name is Helena. Julie gave you a brief introduction. I'm with the Build Up team and have been doing, particularly over the past few years, a lot of work on social media analysis for Peacebuilders. And Maude will say hi in a minute when I hand over the baton to her. But so she was at Build Up for a number of years, and now she's at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue as their advisor on social media and conflict mediation. We're going to be talking a little bit about a social media analysis toolkit for Peacebuilders and Mediators that we collaborated in putting together. In case you don't have it, I suspect many of you have looked at this, but in case you don't, I've just put the link in the chat. I'm also going to be talking through it and sharing. Of course, my doorbell goes at exactly the moment when I'm talking in the webinar. I'm just going to ignore that. I'm going to be sharing it on my screen as well as talking through some of the different sections in it. If you are looking at the toolkit right now, you'll see that it has. I'm gonna have to get that. So, Maude, do you want to start on the outline because you know what it's like, and I'll deal with my doorbell. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone. So thanks Julie and Helena for the introduction. I'm really happy to be back on one of the Build Up webinars. So the outline that Helena was referring to, so she's going to share with you when she comes back she's going to share her screen and show you the toolkit, but essentially what we're going to do today is explain to you briefly why we started this work, why we developed this toolkit. We're going to give you a very quick demo of how to use it, how it works, what it looks like. Then I'm going to share a little bit about what we can actually use this for. So what does it look like to really do social media analysis? I will share with you some case studies of work that we've done on social media analysis, and Helena will too. And then we will be asking you a couple of questions at the end, namely, what are you going to be doing with your own social media analysis? We'd love to hear more about how you plan to use this toolkit, and also what you think would be useful in this toolkit and possibly others. So Helena, I'm glad you're back. You can take over on the next bit.
The peril of working from home, you can put your phone on mute, but not your doorbell. So thanks Maude, and that's exactly what I was going to do, just share a bit of an outline of what we're going to cover. So I'll get stuck in immediately to the first part, which is talking about why we've developed this toolkit. I think what Maude and I both agreed with, and at Build Up and at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue we've been seeing, is that mediators and peacebuilders are interested in using information about actors and narratives on social media to inform programming. But many mediators and peacebuilders are really not sure how to go about that. What does it take? What skills and resources are needed? And also, what are the options and what are the limits of what can be done? And I think critically also, many are not sure exactly why. There's this kind of hype around, we should be looking at social media. But when it comes down to it, not everybody can really answer the concrete question of what programming social media analysis can inform, and when is it really worth investing resources into this kind of analysis? Because it does take resources, varying levels depending on what you're doing, but it's not entirely free of human resources or technical resources, right? So having done quite a bit of social media analysis at our respective organizations in different contexts, we thought, let's really try to do an honest toolkit that really outlines why social media analysis is sometimes useful and not always. So the toolkit is also meant almost like a decision-making tool, so you can read it and decide whether you should be doing social media analysis, and if so, then how would you go about it? And I think part of the reason for that is that we know many peacebuilders and mediators don't get what they want when they engage with social media analysis. And that was a little bit the gap that we were trying to fill. That's why I'm saying it's quite an honest toolkit in that respect. Our starting assumption is that users of this toolkit don't have the resources to either hire a specialist social media analysis firm or to pay for commercial social media analysis tools. So If you have those resources, then maybe what you can do is just kind of outsource this decision and this analysis. Point of caution there, that doesn't always work. As both Maude and I know, sometimes that means that you get something that is completely not connected to the priorities of the peace building or the mediation field. So then the toolkit itself, the how-to section offers options for different tools that you can use, but it's set out more as a process rather than a manual to using a specific tool. So it's a little bit tool agnostic in that sense. I just want to pause there and point out that at Build Up, we have developed our own tool. It's called Phoenix. And if you want to know about it, then Julie will post a link to a webinar we did recently where we talk about Phoenix. But we're not going to talk about that today because we're not talking about a specific tool. We're talking about the process of social media analysis and how we engage with that as peace builders and mediators. Okay, so now I really am going to share my screen so that you can see the toolkit if you haven't got it open. Julie, I think you need to give me permission so I can do that. Or if you can't give me permission, then you can share the screen. Oh, there we go. Now I have permission. There we are. So this is what the toolkit looks like. It's quite easy to navigate. It gives you a bit of a summary here and sort of an outline of what the tool is like. And you'll see that the sections basically cover, in section 1, what is it possible to do with social media analysis for peace building? In section 2, specifically, how would you work with Facebook and Twitter data? And then in section 3, a series of case studies. So I want to show you a little bit of what's in these sections, although not all of it, obviously. So if I launch the toolkit, there we go. So once you launch the toolkit, the different sections will appear as you go through them, and you can also use this navigation bar on the side, right? So in this section on what is it possible to do with social media data, we talk about what the use cases are, how you select social media platforms, and how you understand what data is available. I think this section on what are the use cases is probably one of the most interesting, because essentially this is the answer to the why question. So we're trying to say, why would you do social media analysis and how does it connect to programming? We basically look at these 3 types of ways of doing social media analysis: daily or regular monitoring, narrative analysis, and actor mapping. And then we connect it to programming. Maude and I are going to do a deep dive into this section because we think it's the most interesting. So we'll be talking more about this later. And then on the section on selecting social media platforms, what it basically takes you through is what are the different steps that you need to follow in order to decide what social media platform you need to look at. So how to assess which ones are most interesting for the question that you have related to peace building or mediation. And then the final one, which is the understanding what data is available, is a little bit more technical, but the reason to have it here is that often people think, oh, we can look at any kind of social media data. And actually there are lots of restrictions. So this outlines the restrictions in quite a lot of detail in case you're going in that direction. So for example, one thing that often happens is people think that you're going to be able to use Facebook private profiles, but that's not the case. Section 2 is a deep dive on how to work with Facebook and Twitter data because they are the most prevalent. The basic steps that are outlined here, step 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are around deciding what data to work with, getting data, and storing and organizing that data, and then looking for patterns, apply to actually any other platform as well. So as a process, you can apply it across many things. And then section 3 is a series of case studies that we've gathered from Build Up and the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. I won't take you through them, although we will be talking about some of them in a minute, but you can look at them at a glance and then you can go to each one of the cases. They're labeled so that you can quickly navigate to them according to what kind of things you're interested in. So what platform, what kind of analysis, what kind of tool that was used to perform the social media analysis. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview. We just wanted to make sure that everybody had eyes on the actual toolkit. And now I'm going to hand over to Maude to talk about what can we actually use this kind of analysis for, including some case studies.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I hope that you will all find that really useful, and thanks, Helena, for giving us a bit of a demo. I think we really want this toolkit to help you think through, I think, what's the most important question, which is what can you actually learn from social media analysis and how can it be useful to you? We really think that there is no point doing social media analysis for the sake of it, and the toolkit should, and I think does help clarify what you can get from analysis and what you can't. But let's focus for now on what you can get from analysis, at least what we think can be helpful. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons that we at HD and kind of as mediators do social media analysis and some of the examples of things we've learned from it. And Helena will also add in some perspectives of what can be learned from more of a peace building perspective from the build up side. But essentially, I think regardless of where you are and what you're doing, whether you're a mediator or a peace builder or many of the things in between, there are, I think, two things that social media analysis can help you do. And these are really clearly outlined in the toolkit in that first section. So the first is understand how people speak about a particular conflict or a particular peace process or a program. So that is understanding what people are saying, which topics are popular, what kinds of content are being shared, etc. So first question is, how are people talking about this issue? Second question is who. So understanding who is most influential in the online space when we're talking about a conflict or a peace process. So, okay, we have these two main questions, right? How are people talking about this? And who is talking to who and who is having the most impact? So those are the overall questions that we think can be useful. But then we can dive a little deeper into these questions. And I think one thing we've learned from doing social media analysis in different places with different teams is that the more specific you get about what you're trying to find out and the question that you're asking when you're going into social media analysis, the more useful it's going to be. So even those two questions that I just gave you are probably too broad. When you're starting a social media analysis and you're reading through our toolkit, you probably need to be a little bit more specific than just saying, okay, how is people talking about a conflict? So if you were a mediator or you were working at HD, you might want to break that down into a few more specific questions. So for example, you might want to ask yourself, if you're working on a peace process or a dialogue process, is there a lot of negative sentiment about this process in the social media space? Are people criticizing the dialogue? Are people opposing certain elements of a particular agreement, etc.? Or you might want to be asking, is disinformation being shared about the peace process? This is something that mediators in particular are very concerned about. They're concerned, for example, about disinformation claiming that agreements have been reached or, making false assumptions about the peace process. Or you might want to ask, are some issues more unpopular or causing more controversy than others? All of these questions then have implications for our work, right? So we're not just asking them because we're interested in them, although we are. We're asking them because when we conduct the analysis and we answer those questions, we can then say, okay, are the peace talks that we're working on addressing the issues of the constituents that we're trying to reach? So are there topics we're seeing online that actually the peace talk is not addressing that we need to adjust? Or we might want to say, how is HD as a mediation organization being perceived in this country? Are we being criticized? Are we even being associated with the peace talks? And if so, we probably need to at least know it and probably do something about it. Or are there specific kinds of content? I mentioned disinformation, but there are others that are making our job as mediators harder. And if so, what do we do about it? So those are some of the questions that we at HD find useful. I don't know, Helena, if you have others that fall under that category of what is being said.
Yeah, because I think in the category of what's being said, right, we were saying, Maude, that it's a little bit different for peace builders. So I always think about the different peace building organizations we've worked with on social media analysis, the kind of questions that they ask themselves, or that we ask ourselves, are more around how is sentiment changing across topics, and what does this tell us about polarization? So thinking particularly about peace builders that are involved in maybe track 3 dialogue processes, which are slightly different to mediations around a peace process, right? I think this issue of what's polarizing and how's that different across topics is really interesting. And then connected to that, what topics are discussed together on social media, and what does this tell us about narratives that might be bridging narratives between different groups, and that therefore might be really ripe for a community dialogue that could begin to address some broader, more sort of national dialogue or society-wide issues. And then, conversely, are there topics or types of content that are clearly polarizing, either because they are discussed in isolation, so they appear to be in an echo chamber, or because they have very different sentiment associated with them, or because they're only discussed by certain types of people, which gets a little bit into the next question about who is talking, the actor analysis. They're never completely separate. And I think that's in a lot of the peace building actors we've worked with, that's particularly important when it's topics around identities. So the expression of identities on social media often garners a lot of polarization, a lot of very different sentiment depending on who is sharing it. Also a lot of trigger words that are associated with hate speech or with incitement to violence. And again, a bit like what Maude was saying, it's not just we ask these things because they're interesting, but because actually they can really help inform peace building programming. So understanding how people speak about a conflict or about a particular conflict driver on social media as opposed to offline can inform peace building program that aims at narrative change online, which of course is not the entire picture. But I do think that this idea of digital peace building programming that is connected to social media analysis is something that has a lot of very practical uses. Okay, Maude, so do you want to talk about the who question, the second question?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So the second big question that we present in the toolkit is, okay, social media analysis can help you identify who is talking about a conflict or a peace process or an issue within that, right? So again, to try and make that a little bit more specific and a little bit more practical, some of the questions we might ask ourselves, and I think the questions are probably quite similar for both Helena and I from both of our perspectives, but the questions you would ask would be, for example, which actors have the most influence in the online space? And you all will know from wherever it is that you're working that that is not always the same as the influence that people have in the offline space, right? So there can be very influential community leaders that may have zero influence when it comes to online conversations and vice versa. So it's important that we're looking at influence in the online space as well as looking at influence in the offline space. We also can look at which actors have the most engagement. So not just, who has the greatest following, but who is actually provoking the most conversation about these topics. So, I may have 20,000 Twitter followers. I definitely don't. But if I did, I may be able to reach them all with one tweet, but nobody may respond to that tweet. Nobody may reshare it. And so actually, I don't have a great deal of influence. I don't provoke a lot of engagement. Often it's the engagement that we care about as mediators and peace builders, because that's where a lot of the discussion and debate and potential kind of polarization can take place.
Hey, Maude, can I interject on that
yeah,
one?
Please.
Because I think one thing that we found a lot, this issue of engagement is really interesting, right? Is that the assumption that peace builders will come to a piece of social media analysis with is that, this actor that they keep reading on Twitter or that they keep showing up in their feeds is really influential. And often, not always, but sometimes those actors are actually very prolific. So they're kind of flooding the whatever platform it is with their content. But they're getting very little engagement. So it's not just about how many followers do you have, but also like sometimes very prolific actors. A key example of this is media outlets, traditional media outlets who tweet or post every time they have a headline, right? So it feels like they're flooding the content space, but actually they're getting very little engagement. Most people are essentially ignoring that content. So I think this point about really being able to untangle that and seeing who is engaging with what and to what extent really gets to influence much better.
Yeah, totally. And I think we have a tendency to talk about like social media influencers now as people that we should be talking to and engaging with, without thinking about how we actually measure their influence and what kind of influence we care about, because ultimately we don't care about as much about a kind of one-way megaphone as we do about people who are actually provoking debate and discussion and potentially widespread sharing, etc. So yes, definitely. I think the other thing that we would want to ask ourselves is who is connected to who, right? So when a certain figure is speaking in the online space, who are they actually connecting to? Who's hearing them? Who's engaging with them, and who's also not hearing them and not engaging with them? I remember we did a really interesting piece of analysis in Lebanon when I was at Build Up, and we looked at, for example, when the international NGO community makes comments about political issues in Lebanon, and we could clearly see that the vast majority of actors online are not hearing them. They're speaking in their own kind of bubble, and you can only see that when you do kind of network analysis. The other question we might ask is, okay, are there any positive influences as well as negative influences? But this is particularly interesting. Are there people who are kind of positively influencing the debate around a peace process or a conflict? Because those are people that we might want to engage with that we may not necessarily otherwise have engagement with in the offline space. Helena, whenever you lean forward, I think you want to say something, so just interrupt me if you do.
I just need glasses. I'm trying to read the comments.
So,
can I just say, I think we're going to address questions towards the end. So please keep them coming. Iba, I see your question, but we're going to address them later.
Yeah, perfect. Again, just to show you why those questions that I mentioned are not just interesting intellectually, but interesting for practical reasons. One thing we would think about then, if we were in HD doing this kind of analysis, is, okay, should we actually be engaging different kinds of actors in our mediation process? So let's say we're having a dialogue with traditional actors who we know have a lot of influence on the conflict offline. Should we actually be having either a separate dialogue or a more extensive dialogue with other kinds of actors? We've had the discussion about engaging with influencers in places like Ethiopia and Ukraine and so on. And then same for peace building programs. Should they be engaging with different kinds of actors in their own programming? So if you're running a digital peace building effort, do you want to be engaging with some of the either positive influences or negative influences in your programming? And I think, yeah, this concept of understanding which actors in a given conflict have the most influence and create the most engagement on social media, and also understanding who they're engaging with and who they're actually influencing. So not just how many people, but what constituencies, what types of people, etc. That's really important for both of our programs, so peace building program and mediation programs that aim to engage in conflict actors, for example, in dialogue, or engaging in narrative change, which is often a big part of peace building programming. So you really need to be talking to the right people if you want to be creating the kind of change that we are ultimately trying to get to. So that's a little bit about the two main questions. I just want to add maybe a kind of third question, which we don't necessarily call out in the toolkit, but which is really important, I think, for both of us, is this idea of, we also want to do social media analysis because we're interested in finding out what are some of the online conflict drivers that we as a mediation actor or as a peace building actor should and could be addressing. So that means, to say that more simply, we're not just interested in how is social media acting around our program. So how can social media be used to promote or oppose a dialogue process, for example, but we're actually saying, okay, how is social media being used to make the conflict worse? Because if it is being used to make a given conflict worse, then we should be addressing that head on and trying to deal with it in our programs. So to give you an example, if we're analyzing a given conflict and our social media analysis reveals that both sides in a conflict are using coordinated disinformation campaigns against the other side, then as HD, when we engage those conflict parties in talks, when we bring them to a table in dialogue, shouldn't we also be discussing the topic of disinformation campaigns at that table, and potentially also in any kind of agreement that we reach? So any of you that have heard me speak before know that this is an issue I care a lot about, but I do think social media analysis can help us really see, okay, what's making the conflict worse.
And I think maybe at this point we can actually address the question that was posed by Iba about, she says, what about the demographic of non-interactive followers who see media headlines, repeat them offline, but that link isn't presented in social media platforms? And the reason I want to bring this in now is to just be really clear that neither Maude nor I think that you should only conduct social media analysis, or that social media analysis gives you the full picture of the conflict dynamics at play. What it does is it gives you a window into the digital conflict drivers, or the online conflict drivers, if you want, that we know are affecting offline. So I think, what we're trying to say is there are certain things that we can see online that need to feed into the overall conflict analysis in any particular space. But it should not be done on its own. And I think, Iba, your point is right. Maybe there will be some non-interactive followers who see these media headlines and are actually repeating it offline, and we should keep that in mind. It's still important that certain actors are flooding the space with content, even if they're not getting the engagement online, maybe they are offline, and that should be kept in mind. But in terms of what we can see online, we're more interested in what kind of influence there is from people who create a debate, which I think there was somebody just sharing a really interesting example from Cameroon, which you can read in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Thanks, Iba and Prince, who I'm also happy to say are both my colleagues. So I'm excited that you're here. To just quickly, that's kind of the overview of why in general you might want to engage in social media analysis. I just wanted to put out there some of the key objections that apply when we say, okay, let's conduct some social media analysis to support our mediation work, for example. These are the kinds of things we hear, and I want to put them out there because I think many of them are valid, but they also inform the discussion that we can have afterwards. So we often hear, for example, okay, social media analysis is too time consuming. The amount of data is too huge and it would take us too long to trawl through it. We also hear a common objection that the online discussion in wherever we are doesn't really reflect the real sentiment of people. So the online conversation is just a small part, it's a snapshot, it's influenced by a certain type of people, particularly if you have a low level of internet penetration, for example. So that's another objection. We also hear people say, there's so much online that you cannot know. Helena mentioned at the beginning, there's some data that you just can't get, like private profiles, for example, or encrypted messaging chats, so WhatsApp, for example. So people often say, well, then what's the point if we can't reach that kind of information? Another objection, and I'm just going through them, I'm not going to discuss them in detail, but I want you to think about them as we go through. Another objection is, well, this is great. Well, we present you with some social media analysis, but we can't do anything with it. It's not actionable, or we just don't know how to integrate this into our work. And I think the final thing that we hear a lot is, well, we already know this. So social media analysis confirms things that if we are intelligent and we're following a conflict closely, we probably already knew. Now, the toolkit that we presented does not go into detail about trying to debunk any of these criticisms. What it does do, though, is try to provide some case studies that show how this can be done, what it can be used for, and the kind of resources that it entails. And what I would say to all of those objections is, one, look at the case studies, talk to people who have done this successfully, because there are ways around those objections. And two, the more specific you are about the purpose of your analysis, the more able you will be to overcome those objections. So I'm going to give you some examples of ways that we've used social media analysis at HD, and we'll add a bit about build up, and we can come back and see if that helps address some of the concerns, which I'm sure some of you have. So there are, I think, 3 ways that we have been using social media analysis to support our work. The first one is, I think, probably perhaps the most interesting, which is actually directly linking the social media analysis to the development of programs and projects. So at HD, that means conducting social media analysis and then using that to decide on a particular mediation intervention. So just to give you a quick example from Kosovo, we conducted some analysis of social media last year, and we did a relatively broad assessment of Facebook narratives using CrowdTangle as an analysis tool, looking at how people were talking about the Serb-Kosovo dialogue efforts historically. That was the issue we were focused on. The analysis essentially showed us that there was a great deal of polarization, that there was a great deal of problematic content, and it paved the way for us to actually intervene and develop a mediation approach around this particular topic. We ended up, in fact, developing a set of social media declarations ahead of local elections in Kosovo. So we weren't directly addressing the Serb-Kosovo dialogue, which the analysis was about, but the analysis showed us that this was also an issue internally in Kosovo. And so we decided to address it through mediation around the local elections. The analysis helped us, I guess, identify what the issues were that those declarations would want to address. Helped us identify who the key actors were that we would want to involve. One thing that was really important is it showed us the role of media houses on social media in promoting sort of harmful content. And so we engaged them directly. We had a declaration purely for media houses about social media behavior ahead of the elections. And I guess most importantly, it helped us understand that this was an issue in Kosovo that A, was very prevalent, and B, that we felt we could address through this kind of mediation approach. So a direct link between a very exploratory analysis and a specific mediation activity. And I think you have an example here too.
Yeah, so I think I just want to say this, that these I've just posted them in the chat in case people wanted to follow along, but these 3 ways to use social media analysis that Maude is outlining, I think apply as much to mediators as to Peacebuilders, but just in slightly different ways, right? And so this first one about analysis to inform programming, I wanted to just talk about something which is an ongoing piece of work on our side. We're collaborating with the British Council and with an organization in Tunisia to look at an analysis of social media narratives between younger people and the older generation. And before I give you the example, I just want to wheel back to something Maude said, in response to the objections. She said it's really important to be very specific. And what we've been doing at Build Up is the way we do that is we define problem statements ahead of any piece of social media analysis. So we get very, very clear about what is the problem statement that we want to investigate through this piece of social media analysis. Saying we want to look at conflict on social media isn't going to cut it. And so in this case, it was, let's look at how the conversation between younger people and the older generation is playing out on social media, particularly around topics that might be polarizing, like mental health, drugs, various political topics. The purpose of conducting that analysis was to define what kind of narrative change programs could be used to improve the relationship between young people and the older generation on these very polarizing topics. I won't go into all of the findings, but I wanted to highlight one that is particularly interesting, which is we did a network analysis of people who were commenting on a series of YouTube channels. And what was really interesting is there were these kind of 2 very obvious polls, one that was dominated by the older generation, the other one dominated by younger people. In the older generation, you had a lot of stuff around politics. In the young people, you had a lot of stuff around anime, sports. Can't remember all of them, but it was all entertainment focused, etc. And then there was this big section in the middle, which was kind of essentially a bridging. So people who were commenting on both topics that were of interest to the older generation, topics that were of interest to the younger generation, and they were all also commenting on Vox Pop. So basically, the finding, what it showed us is that Vox Pop was a content type that both younger people and older people were interested in commenting on and were commenting on together. So it could be a bridging space, essentially. So if we wanted to address any of these polarizing topics, then maybe doing it in the format of a Vox Pop would be quite effective. So that's a very specific finding, but I just think it's useful to showcase how it can really inform programming. Back to you, Maude.
Thank you. So we'll talk a bit about the second area where I think social media analysis can inform programming, and that's in the idea of setting the agenda for either for dialogue or for discussions or potentially for consultations that we would be running either as mediators or as peace builders. So this is something we've started to do a bit more at HD, although I think we're still kind of exploring and discovering this, probably quite far behind build up in this particular example, but one place where we're trying to do this a little bit, and I'm not going to say too much because I know that the person who actually does all of this analysis is on this call, and I'm sure she would be able to tell you much more if you have questions about it. But in Sudan, our excellent analyst is conducting weekly monitoring of the social media space in Sudan related to a particular area. So in this case, the specific focus is not so much on the topic, but on the location. So we're looking at how is our conflict issues and political issues being discussed in one area of Sudan. At the same time, this was going back to last year. Things are a little bit different right now, but HD was conducting both in-person consultations on the ground as part of our dialogue and mediation efforts, and more recently online consultations as part of efforts to engage with different kinds of communities, including diaspora communities. Now, the social media analysis that was being done was really important in informing the kind of agenda setting of those discussions. So helping us see, for example, are there particular issues when it comes to security or justice that are being really discussed very prominently on social media, and if so, can we move those up the agenda so that they are discussed more concretely in our consultations and in our dialogues. And I think this is something that would be very applicable in many different places where HD is working, where the setting of the agenda takes into account oftentimes offline consultations, discussions with actors, bilateral meetings, etc., but not necessarily the online space.
And I think equally, this idea of setting the agenda, maybe it's not quite, we don't think about it in those terms, but deciding what kind of topics need to be part of a consultation or of a national dialogue process is something that is also done typically in ways similar to what Maude was describing offline. We also think that bringing an online component to that can be interesting. So I want to give an example of a piece of work that we did in Yemen for the Office of the Special Envoy to the Secretary General, where we essentially conducted some analysis covering a selection of Twitter accounts and public Facebook pages and groups that discuss issues related to women and peace. And the purpose of this it was quite a quick piece of research. It didn't actually take that long, was to inform topics and outreach for a consultation that was to be held subsequently. And I think, I won't go through all of the findings, but I wanted to highlight one, which is that the narrative analysis that was also that. So we conducted some narrative analysis on Twitter specifically, that was really useful. Primarily using quantitative analysis by looking at how posts were clustered by keyword use, and then from that understanding what the main conversations might be underneath them. And what this analysis showed was one prevailing conversation topic, which was basically a set of keywords that were being used together across the entire Twitter network that we were looking at. And then 4 smaller conversation topics, which were basically kind of networks of keywords on other topics. And then we cross-checked these conversation topics by doing a quick analysis of the top hashtags. And the conversation topics that were identified we thought were of real interest in setting the agenda for the consultations to come, as they both kind of validated some of the topics that we had already identified through offline analysis, but also added some new elements that were not receiving much attention offline, but certainly were garnering a lot of attention online. So it's this kind of like, not obviously not just relying on this analysis, but adding it to an offline analysis to decide on what should be the topics of a consultation or of a national dialogue process that I think can be quite interesting. Back to you.
And also a nice little counter to the objection that social media only tells us things we already know. So very nice. Tells
you some things you know and some things that are new, right? But
exactly.
I think also validating some things that you know is quite useful at times. So yeah, for
sure. It's unlikely to totally surprise you if you've been kind of intelligently following the situation, but it can give you new ideas and also affirm assumptions. So the third and final way that I think social media feeds into programs is using social media analysis to identify and be able to mitigate specific conflict triggers. So specific moments where I'm thinking of moments where social media analysis tells you something is happening that has the potential to make things worse, and therefore you are able to respond to that thing. So I'll give you the example of Libya here, where we were conducting ongoing social media analysis during a particular event in the peace process last year, and in a moment which was very volatile, and it was a very important moment in the peace process. And one thing that this analysis did, which was really interesting, is helped us identify the links and better understand the impact between the social media conversation that we were seeing on Facebook predominantly and the actual mediation process, so the dialogue that was happening on the ground behind closed doors. And I think identifying the patterns between online activity and offline activity is actually something that we need to do a lot more of. I think to really understand, okay, how much does social media really have an impact on peace talks and on peace processes? But also, whilst we were doing that kind of longer analytical piece, we also were able to respond quickly to things that we identified on social media that potentially threatened developments in the peace process. So for example, we saw a set of fake accounts be set up, pretending to be participants in the dialogue process. And you can imagine the risk that this would pose both to those participants and also potentially to the process overall and to the trust in the process, etc. So it's only if you are really kind of keeping a close eye on social media that you would be able to identify things like that. Another thing that we and others who were conducting social media analysis were able to identify was threats against participants in the peace process, some of them quite serious. So being able to see those and respond to them is actually a critical step, not just for dealing with the social media environment, but for actually ensuring that the peace process can continue and do its work and protecting that space. We've seen also, for example, things like fake agreements being shared on social media. And of course, if you're not being very responsive to what's happening online, you wouldn't see those things. And as mediators, that would be a pretty big blow if that went viral, as it has done in this case. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think just this idea of like how to use social media analysis in this more regular way to mitigate conflict triggers. We did a piece of work commissioned by UNDP in Lebanon to develop a social media analysis dashboard, which is now live, and it basically gathers every 3 days data from a selected list of Facebook pages and Twitter accounts, quite a large list. And UNDP also conducts offline regular monitoring of how tensions are unfolding across the country. So the idea of this dashboard was to add to it how tensions are discussed on social media, to add another piece of analysis. And we've been talking to the colleagues at UNDP who have been using this dashboard now for a number of months, and the dashboard they say contributes to UNDP situational awareness, which informs their conflict programming. So this is a much more kind of like, if you have a long-term peace building program and you're looking for something to enhance your conflict analysis, then maybe this kind of regular monitoring could help. And at this point, I just want to address one point that was in the chat that I think is relevant to this point, which is actually also about Lebanon. So Reina makes a really good point here, where she says, in Lebanon, I'm just going to be able to read it better here. In Lebanon, for example, amidst the compounding crisis we are living in, it's been noticed that social media platforms have been sought after for venting and expressing anger. I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I do want to read her preliminary conclusions. So she says, one of the preliminary conclusions we can lay down is that in conflict settings, social media analysis offers accessible, more or less, spaces for venting out, which is one coping mechanism. Thus, while social media analysis will indeed help us understand the trending narratives and sentiments, it is important to triangulate online findings with offline findings. Completely agree with that. I agree a bit less with the last sentence about, I think social media analysis is very important, but in itself can be subject to bias. Or it's not that I don't agree with it, it's just that I think all conflict analysis is subject to bias. And I wanted to, Reina, maybe you agree with that, I'm not saying you don't, but the reason I want to highlight that is that this objection that social media analysis is biased is an objection that I think always needs to be counterbalanced by the fact that all conflict analysis is biased to a certain extent because it's subjective. And the biases that apply to social media are different, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't add to the full picture. Maude, is it back to you? I think so.
Yeah, just a few final thoughts, and then we'll stop. But just some of the key things that we've learned from these various case studies that we presented to you, and that we're still learning as we go along, that address some of the questions in the chat too. So the first one is we've seen that analyzing specific events or specific topics for HD at least work a lot better than doing a general analysis on the social media space. So very quick example, in Yemen last year, we did a very broad analysis of how is social media affecting the peace process. And it was interesting, but we struggled to really utilize it. More recently, we've been conducting analysis on a very specific topic within the Yemeni conflict, which we are also engaging in some mediation efforts on. And being able to analyze that very specific topic, who's talking about it, how is the conversation shifting, is much more actionable and useful and more interesting to our colleagues, and has more direct implications. We can see, for example, okay, when we engaged in this dialogue, how did the social media conversation shift on this topic? So it's really clear. So smaller scope, more useful analysis. The other thing, and this relates to the comment about Lebanon, is investment in social media analysis alone is never going to be enough. Social media analysis will never just be a kind of magic wand which will improve your life and your programs and your world. It has to be something that you engage with. You have to invest in also comparing that analysis to events on the ground and engaging with the analysis, trying to understand it, link it to what you're already doing, and so on. And that's where we've seen it be the most useful. I mentioned the Libya example, when we had a commitment to conducting online analysis and linking it to the offline space, we got a lot more interesting findings than just, this goes back to Eleanor's comment at the beginning, outsourcing it to a private company or using an online tool that just does it for you and that's it. Yeah, I think I'll stop there because those are the two key takeaways, and I'm excited to have a very short amount of time for chat. Sorry.
Oh, we have so many questions. I don't even know what to do with all of these. I'm gonna try my best. There is okay, so there's a couple of people who have asked about lexicons, both here and in the Q&A. And I think that my quick answer to that is it depends on what you are doing, but yes, most of the time a lexicon is important to develop, particularly in a piece that is about organizing the data. So basically applying high-level tags that allow you to organize it better. If you go into the toolkit, there's a section that talks about the importance of classifying data, and most of the time that requires a lexicon. Maude, just jump in if you don't agree with me. Okay, and then there was a question about, What else do we have here?
There's a question from Rachel on how do you approach the demographics of social media. I think if I'm not wrong, there's a section on that in the toolkit, pointing you to some common places where you can find that data, sort of just open source data.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would say, Rachel, is geotagging of social media data is generally not very effective, as in using the geotags that are provided by the social media platforms for various reasons that I think are explained in the toolkit, or you can send one of us an email and we'll explain it. So often what we do is we use the location of administrators of pages or of accounts in order to determine geographic location, which is not perfect, but is a solution. There's a question about Libya. Do you want to answer that one? Might be better for you, Maude. Do you want me to read it out?
If I can find it. Yeah, go ahead.
Have you seen any significant cooperation from the actual social media platforms to work with you or other entities to take down misinformation, etc.? That's perfect for you, Maude.
It depends on how positive I'm feeling when I wake up in the morning as to how I answer that question. There is some cooperation, and in particular, there's cooperation around the analysis in terms of providing access to the CrowdTangle, which is Facebook's tool for analysis. So that is something that has been possible for a number of researchers and conflict actors like ourselves. When it comes to removing content, there is also an appetite to engage with actors like us. And we have seen some progress, particularly in Libya, around removing content, but as I think is kind of clear from the extent of the problem, this is, that there is still major limits to what can be done and how quickly the platforms respond. And also, I think Sarah made a really good comment in the chat about the nuances of language and disinformation versus sarcasm, and I think that's something that social media platforms are still struggling with. We see it in a lot of the content that we care about when we analyze peace processes is not necessarily content that Facebook or Twitter would take down. So for example, disinformation about a peace process is probably not going to violate Facebook's rules and regulations, but it might be problematic and may actually contribute to conflict for a number of other reasons. So at the moment, there's a long way to go in terms of reconciling, I think, the conflict challenge and the response of the platforms.
Maude, you want to type your email address in the chat, because I think some people are going to want to continue this conversation with either one or both of us. I just want to pick up on a couple of the other questions that are on here. A couple of people, and I'm sorry the chat has gotten too long for me to follow up, have asked about Kenya and whether we have done any work in Kenya. I can answer from build up, we have, and we are continuing to do quite a lot of work in Kenya. I noticed, George, you talked about the upcoming general elections, and actually one of the pieces of work is likely to be linked to that. So if you want to talk, drop me a line and I'll put you in touch with Caleb, who's our lead in Kenya working on this. And then I just wanted, there was another point by Abdurrahman. Where'd it go? There we go. That said, any evidence of how the analysis has directly impacted the final outcome of the program, consultations or dialogues it was meant to inform. And Abdurrahman, I have a slightly cheeky response to that, also because of time, which is, would you say that you have any evidence that your offline conflict analysis has had an impact on the outcomes of your programming? I think it's very difficult to say we did this analysis and that made our programs more impactful, other than to point out that it informed the way that that program was designed. So the example that I gave you, for example, about finding this thing about Vox Pop being a bridging content medium is the kind of thing that I could point to. But then, does that mean that the program is then more effective? I'm not sure I would be able to do that with offline conflict analysis, let alone with social media conflict analysis. So that would be my response to that. Don't know, Maude, if you have other thoughts on that. Julie, are we missing any questions? Did we do a good job?
One more in the queue. One more in the Q&A, I think.
Oh, sorry.
And then maybe Zigwise can be the last.
Okay, so there's a lot here that could support early warning. Have you done this over time in any context with that goal in mind? Oof, I feel like we could have a whole webinar on this. I don't think that it can support early warning because I don't think it has predictive. I don't think it can be used for predictions. That's my really short answer. Maude, what's your really short answer?
I think there is a line in the toolkit on this specifically, and I agree. Very challenging. It's context analysis, but not seeing the future. Yeah.
I just don't think it has any predictive quality, and I think we do say that in the toolkit. What was the other question you said we had to answer, Julie?
She said we should.
Yeah.
But I would just like to say, Zigwai, you are able to use the toolkit for analysis in places like Nigeria. Absolutely, that's what it's for.
It's not context dependent, though. I think is the quick answer, right? It's meant to be quite generic, and that's why we have case studies from different places. So yes. Is that it? The recording will be available in case you missed anything. And Julie is just saying that she'll send an email as well to follow up with various links. So I think with that, we are at the hour, and we can just say thank you so much for joining us. We hope that was interesting to you.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Julie, for organizing.
Thank you both. Bye everyone. Thanks for joining.
Bye.